What happens if you take a modern world, but instead of people, it's not people? Well, what usually happens is it's garbage. This type of kids movie seems to lend itself to the laziest pop culture references and jokes about what if animals had the internet, and a soundtrack of generic pop songs for the inevitable dance party at the end. And to be fair, Zootopia does tick all those boxes, but it's actually good. Hell, even 5 years later, and there's still an active online fan base who clearly remember the movie for its progressive message and kid-friendly character. Oh. So furry bait aside, and believe me, Disney's got plenty of that already, Zootopia is a clever, funny, exciting, resonant movie. Its story and themes are surprisingly mature, and it respects its audience and takes its premise seriously. I'm Anna Mackerel, and I'm going to talk about why I like this movie so much and a few of its problems. This will be my first in what is hopefully a long-running series where I review every feature film by Disney Animation Studios. This is all the Disney. Zootopia is a buddy cop crime drama comedy mystery flick. That seems like a lot of genre mixing for a kids movie. It is, but it really works. Now I'm gonna talk spoilers, so if you haven't seen it yet, I recommend it, I recommend watching it, and I recommend coming back here afterwards and watching my video. Set in a semi-futuristic city where predator and prey try to live in peace, Judy, the first bunny police officer, has to team up with Nick, a smooth con artist fox, to solve a series of strange disappearances. They're enemies at first, of course, and end up bonding over how they've both been the victims and at times the perpetrators of discrimination based on species, or speciesism. That. And this becomes the driving theme of the movie and is a very clear parallel for the kind of racism, sexism, etc. that we deal with in our society. A lot of kids' movies that tackle this subject show the big, overt acts of bigotry, and that's actually kind of what Zootopia was originally going to be. Before this movie was rewritten, it was about a city where all the predators were forced by law to wear collars that inhibit their emotions. Nick the fox was the main character and ran sort of a theme park where predators could take off their collars. Concept art for the theme park looked awesome and would have been cool to see animated, but the creators thought it was too dark and made the city irredeemable. What we got instead was, in a lot of ways, a more relevant story to our current society. It tackles the stereotyping and subtle bias we all experience to some degree, and how tricky it can be to not slip into those attitudes. Now, the writers are very upfront with what they're really talking about here. We have lines like, well, it's okay for us to call each other that, and you can't just touch a sheep's wool, and are all bunnies bad drivers? And my personal favorite, you're just a real articulate fella. The use of these common social faux pas make the issues relatable and brings attention to it without demonizing the characters, who stay really likable throughout the whole movie. Judy is all pep and determination, and you really feel her frustration as the world around just starts crushing her dreams. The higher-ups don't take her seriously because she's a bunny, and the people she interacts with hate her because she's a meter maid who's giving them parking tickets. Nick, on the other hand, is this smooth, cynical hustler type, who we find out later never really wanted that role, but got labeled with it by others and eventually just accepted it. We understand his bitterness and his initial scorn of Judy's wish to rise above her designated spot in the animal hierarchy because he tried to himself and was beaten down for it. These two have a really good chemistry throughout the entire film. Watching them interact is great. I love their snarky little arguments when they first meet, their bonding moments as they warm up to each other are really sweet, and their falling out in the end is just heartbreaking. You so want these two to be friends again. Now, I am aware that it's a common trope for the two leads to start inexplicably fighting in the third act, but this isn't one of those times. This conflict is well built up, it's logical, and it's necessary for the resolution of Judy's character arc. We can see early on that Judy doesn't like her parents' bias against predators, but she carries some of that bias herself. As she befriends Nick, she's empathetic, but still doesn't seem to acknowledge her own culpability. When they finally do patch things up, it's one of the most cathartic and tearful scenes I can think of in a Disney movie, except for maybe Mufasa's death and the baby mine sequence in Dumbo. There was Bambi's mom, but I found that more shocking than it was emotional. Oh, and I'm not counting Pixar movies in that category either. It's different studios, folks. Pixar's not Disney. Disney's Disney. Zootopia also has its share of scary moments. There's this one jump scare in particular that had everyone in the theater startled. The action's pretty intense, the animals start turning savage and get this eerie glow in their eyes, but in the big scheme of things, there's been a lot more traumatizing kids movies than this one. One thing that's cool about this story is how well it uses callbacks, where something's introduced and then shows up later in a new context. It seems like in the early 2000s, 2000s, Disney tried to force this certain kind of callback into all their movies. Remember how a character did this one thing? Well, they're doing it again, but this time it saves the day. Usually this was supposed to show how the character had grown or something. Oh, this random thing they happened to have done before, it turns out to be the one thing that'll solve this problem. Like, okay, that was lucky. Thankfully, I feel like the callbacks in Zootopia are more well handled. The most obvious one is that first scene where young Judy acts out her own death at the hands of a predator, which is recreated in the final showdown with the villain. This makes sense because that dynamic of natural enemies is the thing they're both trying to break out of the entire time. It's the thing the whole city of Zootopia exists to oppose. So to have that as the looming threat, and when you find out that, oh, just as in the first scene, they were acting, it feels like a good, meaningful callback to me. Nick's badge sticker kind of represents his partnership with Judy. He doesn't want it at first, then later he flaunts it when they're successful together, and finally he throws it down when he feels Judy's betrayed him. The little carrot recorder pen is initially his MacGuffin since it has incriminating audio of him on it. So when Judy nonchalantly hands it back to him later, it signals their newfound trust and actually creates a really nice moment. This is very similar to the scene where Rapunzel gives the crown back in Tangled. Once the item is returned, we know it's not just that object keeping the characters together anymore. This carrot pen shows up twice more in the movie, and both times marks really big turning points in the narrative. I also got to imagine it's a pretty good merchandising opportunity. Anyone remember that Talk Boy from Home Alone 2 in the 90s? Anyway, another good callback is the scene involving Gideon Gray, a bully from Judy's childhood. Judy watches suspiciously as he turns the corner, her eyes narrowing, and this scene is recreated the first time we see Nick's character. And because Gideon was the first fox that the audience sees, we feel Judy's suspicion of foxes. And at first this seems warranted because Nick is kind of a shifty character. It's only later we find out that it's because of that constant suspicion that he became that way in the first place. And this is a surprisingly effective little bit of commentary. You feel how logical it was for that stereotype to have formed in Judy's mind, but you also feel how unfair it is for Nick to be labeled with it just because of what he was born as. I also really like how the Gideon Gray subplot is resolved. We see Gideon as an adult, and he's really humble and apologetic for the jerk he used to be. And Judy's parents have reconsidered their old attitudes about foxes because of Judy's influence. This simple message about people who seem bigoted or closed-minded or mean being able to improve themselves and change over time is so wholesome. So many kids' movies use their bully characters for a cheap payoff, showing them getting punched or disgraced or something, but I like this resolution so much better. Of course, I should mention the really beautiful train ride scene from the trailers where we see all the different parts of the city. It's pretty, it's creative, it's a lot of fun to see how the city's built to accommodate all these different kinds of animals, lots of creative architecture. When you look at the cities in these movies, they mostly just look like human cities with animal occupants. Zootopia gets props for committing to their world and coming up with all these different accommodations for small animals and large animals and different ways of getting around at different terrain types. It's all a lot of fun to take in. Although I did have to laugh at this bit here. Did you really need that to be a lifting bridge? You couldn't just have the blimp go a little bit higher? I'm not going to go on too much about all the animal-based humor, but it's there. You saw it in the trailer, and yeah, it works. Some of the parts that I laughed at were this part here with the noise. And I love this shot. Although this scene was a little odd to me. She's acting really scandalized at this animal nudist club, but they have the anatomy of a Ken or Barbie doll, which, fine, I'm not expecting them to put elephant junk in a Disney movie, but they're just drawing so much attention to this and there's just nothing there. Now, there were problems in the movie, it wasn't perfect, and I might as well get to the biggest one first. That is the villain. In the 2010s, it seemed like every villain had to be a surprise villain, which usually meant that side character you never expected. You know, the one who's completely unintimidating and we don't see them very much, so there's no tension between them and the hero. Some surprise villains work, and I know this one was never meant to be a big focus in the story, but still, even her hired henchmen were way more powerful and intimidating than her. That ram, Doug, is the one who's actually been carrying out all her evil plans. She's just been calling him up and telling him to do it, and I'm not even really sure why, even after her big monologue. She gives this speech about how fear always wins, and once they've turned against the predators, they'll be united against a common enemy, and somehow this will keep her in power and stop larger animals from discriminating against smaller ones? Like, how? I don't know, it doesn't matter. They fool her in this little twist that I didn't see coming, but man, I never see those twists coming. Even the really, really obvious ones. What can I say? I'm just a fish. It's also worth mentioning that there's not one, but two bad guys taken down by that record them discussing the bad thing they're doing and show it to everyone technique, which I suppose makes more sense in a movie like this, since collecting evidence is a big part of police work, but man, am I getting tired of this plot device. Can't we just go back to the good old days where Disney villains fell off cliffs and died? And since I'm getting into the nitpicks here, let's talk about the references, the pop culture references. We've got a weird reference to Breaking Bad, which, I mean, okay, I guess. And a cringy meta moment about other Disney movies, which I've always disliked. I didn't like it in Aladdin, I didn't like it in Hercules. Holy shit, did I not like it in Ralph Breaks the Internet. There's this long-running gag that's essentially a spoof of The Godfather. Now, the visual humor here is funny. Even the phrase skunk butt rug is pretty funny, but there's still just a little too much movie spoof in here for a Disney movie. Also, what's with all the kids' media that shows the mafia as these chummy, helpful figures? Hey, remember when the heroic cop has her friend, the mob boss, threaten to kill a suspect so he gives up information? Seems a little weird for a kid's film, right? I mean, as far as I know, the mob aren't good guys, though they may be good fellas. But these are all super small gripes. Even a lot of the parts I'm complaining about, I still enjoyed my first time watching it. It's just a really snappy, clever, well-made film with a good story, a good message, really likable characters. In the 2010s, Disney had 3 big guy-girl duos that were not romance stories, which I found really refreshing. While I suppose a Nick-Judy romance is feasible within this world, I don't blame Disney for not wanting to touch interspecies relationships, and every couple that you do see in the movie is of the same species. Let the fandoms do the shipping. They seem to have it pretty well covered. As for sequels, Disney has announced a show coming to Disney Plus with the incredibly inspired title Zootopia Plus. It could be good enough. Nick and Judy are both police at the end of the movie, so the show could follow the crime drama formula, with each episode or season being a different case they have to solve. I don't expect we'll get the same social commentary, and that's probably for the best. After 2020, I somehow don't think cartoon cops will be the most welcome mascots for the voice of equality. As with most Disney shows based on Disney movies, I don't expect it to be great, and that's fine. The movie stands out on its own as a unique entry in their lineup, and one that I'd pretty much recommend to anyone except very small children. I'm gonna give Zootopia a big ol' A. I think it nailed just about everything it set out to do, but the villain reveal and her motive were a little weak, which held me back from giving it the A+. I'd still put it among the best of the CGI Disney movies, all of which I hope to review soon. My plan is to review every single feature by Disney Animation Studios, and your 3 clicks would actually be a really big help in that effort. I hope to see y'all back here for the next one. Until then, I'm Anna Mackerel, and I'm not going anywhere.